Hello, comrades, and welcome to another video on the Russian Revolution Area of Study 2, Consequences of the Russian Revolution. In this video, we're going to look at our second topic of Area of Study 2, which is the Civil War, the Russian Civil War. It took place from 1918, arguably 1917, until 1920. Here are a couple of quotes. First of all, from Vladimir Lenin, who, as you'll remember, in his April theses, he had the slogan, "Peace, bread, land." Well, he seems to have had a change of heart, and now he says that peace, this is a slogan of Philistines and priests. The proletarian slogan must be civil war. By that, he doesn't mean civil war in the sense that we're about to see. He means civil war in the sense of class warfare, like his other slogan, turn the imperialist war into a civil war. Another quote is from Leon Trotsky. He says, "We are fighting to settle the question of whether the homes, palaces, cities, sun, and heavens will belong to the people who live by their labor, to the workers, peasants, and the poor, or whether they belong to the bourgeoisie." So we can see what this civil war is mainly about just from these first couple of quotes. Now, just to recap our last video, this comes directly from the textbook. So it's recapping the Constituent Assembly and the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Now, after some debate, the Sovnarkom allowed the elections for the Constituent Assembly to proceed. The result was an electoral victory for the SRs, who won 52% of the seats, whereas the Bolsheviks only won 24%. Lenin and other Bolshevik leaders went to considerable efforts to downplay the SR majority, reasoning that the Bolsheviks had more votes from workers and soldiers, and that the Constituent Assembly was outdated by the emergence of Soviet power. After only meeting for one day on the 5th of January, the assembly was dissolved by pro-Bolshevik soldiers. There was very little popular protest when the Constituent Assembly was dissolved. The issue of securing a peace deal with Germany was a contentious issue among different leaders and factions of the Sovnarkom, and this caused tension in the government. For instance, Lenin wanted to pursue an immediate peace on any terms. Bukharin wanted no peace and to embark on a revolutionary war. And Trotsky, who ended up leading the negotiations at Brest-Litovsk, pursued the approach of no peace and no war. After protracted and tense talks, the German military invaded Russian territory and forced the Soviet government to sign an even harsher treaty. The terms of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk were severe and humiliating for Russia, and the left SRs refused to ratify the treaty, leaving the Sovnarkom in protest and leaving the Bolsheviks, now known as the Communist Party, the All-Russian Communist Party, as a one-party dictatorship. So that's where we left off. Let's talk a little bit about the beginnings of the Civil War. Now, while Bolsheviks easily gained control of Petrograd in October 1917, this was not the case throughout Russia. In late October 1917, after fleeing the Winter Palace, Kerensky managed to rouse the support of Cossack troops under General Krasnov, and they prepared to march on the capital. On the 30th of October, so just a few days after after the storming of the Winter Palace and the Soviet taking of power, the Sovnarkom military commissars led Red Guards and Kronstadt sailors at the Battle of Pulkovo Heights for the defense of Red Petrograd. General Krasnov's Cossacks were eventually defeated, and Kerensky narrowly avoided being handed over to the Bolsheviks and managed to flee overseas in disguise, where he ended up going to the USA. He married an Australian woman, and he even did some guest lectures at Melbourne University, interestingly enough. That's beside the point. Basically, already straight away as the Bolsheviks took power, there were already some hostilities from groups opposed to the Bolsheviks. The Cossack regions of the Don, the Kuban, and the Ukraine remained hostile to the Bolsheviks. And by December 1917, General Alexeyev had been recruiting a volunteer army of former Tsarist officers and planned to liberate the northern cities of Moscow and Petrograd. All kinds of soldiers and supporters rallied to this volunteer army under the emerging banner of white resistance to the Bolshevik red. So that's some of the beginnings of civil war. Let's have a look at some other early stages of the Civil War. And that's known as the Czech, we can remember that by thinking about the Czech Legion. So following the end of hostilities on the Eastern Front after the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, 40,000 armed Czech soldiers, so from Czech Republic, or at the time Czechoslovakia, were granted permission to cross Russia by rail so as to board ships to France and support the Allies on the Western Front. So it seems like a roundabout way to get to France, but they needed to go from the Eastern Front. They couldn't go over German territory, German occupied territory, so they went all the way across Russia to then catch board ships to France. Now, while crossing Russia, some hostilities broke out between the Czech Legion and provincial Soviets who felt threatened by the presence of so many armed men. From the 22nd of May 1918, the Czech Legion responded to hostilities by defeating local military forces and overthrowing regional Soviet authorities. So this is a foreign power that is overthrowing regional Soviet authorities in sort of central Russia, Siberia area. They helped to establish a new SR-led government on the 8th of June 1918 at the town of Samara on the Volga River, which was in Siberia. This government was called the Committee of Members of the Constituent Assembly. So you can see already why that they still held firm that the Constituent Assembly should have gone ahead and the SRs should be in power. So this government, otherwise known as the Komuk, with support from the Czech Legion, formed a people's army and rapidly advanced against Soviet authorities in Siberia. The Czech Legion seemed to forget about their need to support the Western Front, and they continued traveling back and forth along the Trans-Siberian Railway, overthrowing Soviet forces as they went, and their actions provided an incentive for other groups to organize mass armed opposition to the Soviet regime. So let's have a look at some of these other groups, some of the Civil War armies. So you'll remember that Trotsky, after the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was signed and ratified, well, after the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was signed, he became the Commissar of War rather than the Commissar of Commissar of Foreign Affairs. So on 23rd of February 1918, Trotsky raised a military force of 5 million men known as the Red Army. So he rapidly expanded the Red Guard, which at the time had about 500,000, into a huge military force of 5 million. The forces that opposed the Soviet regime came to be known as the White Armies. So the reason it is the Red Army singular is because it is one united army, while the White Armies included multiple different groups, such as monarchists who were loyal to the Romanovs and wanted to reinstate the royal family, patriots who were resentful of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk and all of the things that Russia lost, people who wanted the Constituent Assembly to be the basis of a new government, refugees who had to flee due to their social class, and political leaders who were ousted by the Bolsheviks. Some White Army leaders included General Denikin, who led the armed forces of southern Russia, basically the areas around Ukraine, Admiral Kolchak, who went about a military coup of the Komuk, who we spoke about, Komuk, sorry, I knew I had that wrong. The Komuk, who we spoke about before, and he overthrew the newly formed government and claimed himself supreme ruler of the Russian state. So he also led White Armies from the east. And General Yudenik, who led the Northwestern Army around the Baltic regions, so that sort of Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia area. So they were the White Armies. There were also foreign interventionist forces, most notably Britain, France, USA, and Japan, as well as armies from neighboring countries such as Poland, who we'll speak about shortly. And they also played a role in the Civil War by sending troops and financial support to the Whites. There were many reasons that these foreign interventionist forces joined the war, but one of the big reasons was an ideological difference, which can be seen in this quote from Winston Churchill, who was at the time the British War Minister. And he spoke of the need to, quote unquote, strangle Bolshevism at birth. The Civil War also included peasant armies. It wasn't as simple as Reds versus Whites. The peasant armies came to be known as the Greens, who supported neither the Reds nor the Whites. They weren't affiliated with either group, but we'll find out shortly how impactful they were. Now, one of the big conflicts during the Russian Civil War was actually the Soviet-Polish War. This started when Poland, who had become independent, decided that they wanted to expand their territory and so invaded Ukraine. They started here where the solid green lines are and invaded all the way to the blue lines, the eastern extent of Poland's conquest in Russia. And so they even managed to capture Kiev. However, many generals, including General Brusilov, who had served under Tsar Nicholas, as well as the provisional governments, and now for the Red Army, they joined the Red Army. This was for many reasons. Firstly, now that Poland was invading Russia, they felt a patriotic duty to defend their homeland. Secondly, they were often pressured into joining the Red Army because their families were held hostage. They were threatened to be executed if they didn't agree to lead the Red Army. So some did it out of patriotism, some did it out of blackmail and pressure. Now, the Poland offensive led to a Red counteroffensive. This led all the way back to just on the edge of Warsaw, so a really strong Russian counter invasion. The Communist Party decided that they wanted to keep going, hoping to inspire an international revolution in Germany and perhaps even in Britain. But they got a little bit too confident. And so led by Joseph Pilsudski, the Poles launched a counteroffensive against the Russian counter-invasion. And the Red Army basically took for granted the fact that Poles saw the Reds as a foreign invader and so weren't so willing to listen to their calls for a revolution. Now, after the Battle of Warsaw, which took place between the 12th and 25th of August, the Red Army was forced to retreat and they reached a peace deal called the Treaty of Riga. Now, this was significant because this war was the last-ditch attempt by the Soviets to bring about an international revolution. And this is spoken about perfectly here by historian A.J.P. Taylor. He says, after the Treaty of Riga, Soviet Russia retreated. Unavowedly and almost unconsciously, the Soviet leaders abandoned the cause of international revolution. So after this, they focused entirely on Russia and abandoned that idea of an international socialist revolution. Now, the Green forces, who I mentioned before, were quite a challenge to the Red Army and to the Soviet powers. So throughout 1919 to 1920, peasant guerrilla fighters held southeast Ukraine. There's more detail about this in the textbook, by the way, which I'd encourage you to read. Until mid-1921, the central province of Tambov was considered a no-go area for Bolsheviks due to an army of 40,000 partisans led by former SR Alexander Antonov. By partisans, it means just ordinary people, not armed, not members of any army. They were just 40,000 ordinary people who created their own army led by a former SR. Now, it's not surprising that a former SR led them, considering the SRs called for a peasant revolution, and so they were very closely aligned with the peasants. By 1920, revolts in the countryside had become so bad that Lenin remarked that peasant insurgents were, quote, far more dangerous than all the Denikins, Udiniches, and Kolchaks put together. Remember that Denikin, Yudenich, and Kolchak were the primary generals and leaders of the White Armies. So Lenin saw the peasant revolts as more dangerous than the White Armies. Historian Jeffrey Swain suggests that the SR Siberian government, so the Kalmuch and later the All-Russian government, can also be considered part of the Green movement. The Civil War was not just red versus white, as we mentioned before, but also a battle between different claims to be the true revolution. So here we've got SRs involved in the fighting, not for the whites, but as part of the Green movement, because they still wanted the revolution to be a peasant-led revolution. Now, the Red Army did emerge victorious from this civil war. And there were four key factors to this. First of all, geography. So let's have a look at geography and ideology. So the fact that the Red Army controlled European Russia meant that they had a higher population to attain recruits. They had 70 million people in the area controlled by the Soviet powers, compared to 8 to 10 million in the White Army regions. Moscow, and having control of Moscow and Petrograd meant that they had access to all the factories. They had arms reserves from the provisional government, from the Tsarist regime. So most of Russia's weaponry was in Moscow and Petrograd, so they had access to all of that. They also had a far more efficient railway network, so they could send supplies and reinforce troops much easier than the White Armies could. In terms of ideology, the Red Army was more united. They had a strong cause and they were confident in their cause. As Marxists, they believed that communism was inevitable, and so they were inevitably going to win this civil war. The White Army, by contrast, the White Armies had ideological differences within themselves. Some were monarchists, some wanted a constituent assembly. So there was no ideological cohesion within the White Armies, which we'll talk about again in just a sec. Also, in terms of ideology, the Red Army was really skilled in the use of propaganda. So they managed to gain popular support through the rhetoric of class struggle and the promise of egalitarian society. Now, we'll look a bit more at Soviet propaganda in class in the next couple of weeks, so that you can get an idea of the type of propaganda used to gain popular support. Trotsky's leadership. So Leon Trotsky was crucial to Red Army success. He managed to organize a professional army of 5 million men in his role as Commissar of War. He instituted harsh discipline, or imposed harsh discipline, to ensure that the Red Army was strong and united. So some examples of this, I'm just going to read from the textbook because there are some great examples of this in the textbook. So Trotsky was ruthless in his determination to achieve a communist victory and imposed harsh discipline on the Red Army. The death penalty was introduced for a range of offensive. Sometimes Chekists, i.e. members of the Cheka, with machine guns were stationed behind advancing troops, ready to shoot anyone who retreated. Red Army soldiers swore a socialist oath of loyalty in which they promised strictly and undeviatingly to observe revolutionary discipline and unquestionably to fulfill all the orders of the commanders. If I break this, my solemn pledge, may general contempt be my lot, and may the strong hand of revolutionary law punish me. So already you can see that harsh discipline was imposed to maintain control over the Red Army soldiers. Now, he also wasn't just, you know, a harsh dictatorial sort of leader. He also assigned high praise for if generals or soldiers did the right thing. And this goes hand in hand with recruiting former Tsarist generals as military experts. So I'll read out again from the textbook about how he used these military experts. So it says, the Red Army did not grow to be a professional force by threat alone. Trotsky was quick to praise and reward those who performed their duties admirably. He was tactful and polite towards the military experts who served the Reds. Trotsky hoped to put former Tsarist officers at ease and foster a sense of loyalty and accomplishment in the new revolutionary army. He argued that a military expert has the right to be respected and shall be respected in the ranks of the Red Army. So he wasn't just a harsh disciplinarian. He was also assigned high praise to and rewards for those that did the right thing. However, knowing that he was assigning former Tsarist generals as military experts, he also attached political commissars to each commanding officer, and their roles were threefold. First of all, they supervised their commanding officers. They ensured that orders from above were carried out effectively, and if they weren't carried out effectively, they would report back to the high command. And they carried out propaganda work among the rank and file soldiers. So spreading the message and lifting morale by sending propaganda from higher up. Now, if failures did occur in the Red Army, punishment was handed out first to the commissar, then the officer. So the political commissar was the person who was most responsible because he was overseeing everything. Now, Trotsky as well was a decisive leader. He raced from front to front. He was constantly on the move, going to offer to lift the morale of soldiers, to help in any way that he possibly could. He had a special armored train, and I'm again just going to read from the textbook because I love this section of the textbook talking about Trotsky. It says, Trotsky's train was manned by military commissars in black leather uniforms and a crack team of specialists that included engineers, medical personnel, machine gunners, and snipers. The train had its own library, electricity generator, and radio station. There was also a printing press for publishing a small newspaper called On the Road. So this is an example of Trotsky printing propaganda as he went and distributing it to spread the message of why they were in this war. It says stores of tobacco, boots, and food were kept on board for soldiers in need of a morale boost. On several occasions, Trotsky's presence at a battlefield galvanized hesitant troops into action and victory. So that just shows what a decisive and present leader he was. He was also an inspiring and brilliant speaker who commanded respect everywhere he went. So Trotsky's leadership during the Civil War cannot be understated at all. Finally, White Army weaknesses. So there was a lack of coordination between generals. Because there were multiple White Armies, generals didn't coordinate with each other when they were choosing to attack a particular area. There was trouble motivating troops, and unlike the Red Army, they didn't maintain discipline very well. There were ideological disagreements, which we've mentioned before, but here's a great quote from General Denikin to talk directly to this. He said, "If I raise the Republican flag, I lose half my volunteers. And if I raise the monarchist flag, I lose the other half. But we have to save Russia." The White Armies were also unable to gain popular support from peasants, workers. They were... because of these ideological disagreements and differences, it was hard to have any unity and to gain support from the people. This also wasn't helped by their poor use of propaganda. So while the Red Army was distributing strong propaganda to get people on side, the White Armies didn't really see the use in it until too late. So ultimately, the White Armies didn't offer a good alternative to the Communist Party. Now, that sort of brings us to the end of this video on the Russian Civil War. Just as a sneak peek, our next two topics are about the same period in history. So between 1918 and 1921, we're going to explore first of all, the communists carried out a period of organized terror known as the Red Terror, and that's going to be our next topic. They also implemented a range of economic policies called war communism that were carried out to continue the revolutionary economic policies and also respond to the Civil War. But these ultimately led to the 1921 famine. So that's going to be topic 4. I hope you found this video interesting, illuminating, and helpful, and I will see you next time.